Hey guys, today we're going to talk about quite the topic, a topic that I have long since abandoned and thought I didn't have anything more to say about. Modern comics. Now, some of you may not know, actually, but previous to this channel taking off, I actually worked for a comic book review site for a couple of years, and I had to review many awful DC comics. I have read so many bad modern day comics that it broke my brain to the point where I didn't even want to read anything or see anything DC anymore after I did so. And you'll be surprised how many other people kind of jumped ship on reviewing just because of how bad the comics were. The quality was terrible. And I know that most people have just jumped ship on reading comics these days in general. And I had done that myself. I stopped reviewing them, except for one video where I talked about old comics once here, but I stopped reviewing them on this channel. I had just given them up completely, and I just had written off comics as a lost cause that I thought were just going to go and die somewhere. But this year, more specifically the latter half of this year, some things brought me back into reading Marvel comics just to try them out, and that is a big thing for me to say because I had been just so gypped from reading any of them and just reading so many terrible ones. Like comic books are the worst comic books I've read are worse than the worst movies I've ever seen. The worst quality of any sort of writing I have ever seen has been in comic books, modern comic books, and just some of the things that they would print were just unbelievable for me. But I kind of got back into the fray because at the top of the year, I really hardcore got back into the X-Men, and lo and behold, there was a new Uncanny X-Men series coming out this year, a relaunch that was going to be led by my favorite character of the X-Men, Rogue. It was going to have Gambit on the team, it was going to have Nightcrawler, it was going to have Wolverine and Jubilee, so basically all my favorite characters on the team, and so of course, and with the artist that drew Rogue and Gambit's wedding, one of the greatest artists that I've seen in comics, modern comics ever, and so of course I had to check it out. So that is what brought me back into reading modern comics on the Marvel side, but then I was hearing about this series from Absolute Batman that was happening from DC, and it took me a very long time to read this, but a lot of people were saying that it was good. But as somebody who has just read far too many horrible Batman comics in her time, I just couldn't bring myself to read it. But I finally did yesterday to give my thoughts on it. But these are the only two comic series I'm reading right now, and I want to check back in them and explain to you what it's like to read modern comics, if it's right to toss them out completely, if this is just an industry that is going to completely disappear, or if there's anything worth going back to. But to get started, I want to explain one thing. One of the main reasons why I quit reviewing comics, and I've never revealed this publicly before, I did a Patreon video about it. One of the reasons why I quit reviewing modern comics is I got so incredibly tired of having to read writers insert their fetishes into comics constantly. Now, sometimes this would be visually, a lot of times it would be verbally, either way, just constantly writers inserting dialogue or visuals or whatever it was into comics where you know this is their fetish, and that I just could not take it anymore. But, so getting into the Uncanny X-Men series, though, it is very frustrating to read because it is like a great plot, a fantastic plot that just isn't executed to its full potential. And what do I mean by that? Well, the plot of Uncanny X-Men is that the mutants, and I'm simplifying this for people who don't know, the mutants have just lost their big home, Krakoa, that was supposed to be like a safe haven for them. They've just lost it, and the X-Men are in some ways no more. The X-Men, as they traditionally were, are no more. And so Rogue especially is feeling very lost right now, and she doesn't know where to go. go, and then she gets motivated by seeing a child die who was a big fan of the X-Men and meeting a group of teenagers to become a new X-Men leader herself. And so she is kind of with this ragtag team of leftover X-Men who don't have a place to go, but they don't have any real support. They just are at this outpost, this house from people that Gambit knows in Louisiana, and they have a makeshift danger room and all that. And it's basically Rogue's attempt to recreate the X-Men, but there is a savage monster on their trail who wants to kill these kids. So that's where we're at now in this story. And there is a lot to like about this comic, and this is once again the comic that I'm still reading comics for and that I look forward to every month. But I am subjectively looking forward to it because I really like the characters involved. Once again, what got me to read this comic is I enjoy the fact that Rogue and Gambit are still together and that the characters are themselves. I am really on a high getting back into these characters and enjoying them, and I just really enjoy seeing them actually be together and actually feel that development in their relationship. It's just nice to see the characters be the way they're supposed to be. And I just jinxed it, didn't I? Once Marvel Comics figures out that fans really like a relationship, they will do everything in their power to break them up. So I am still very trepidatious that Marvel is going to do something to break up these characters. I hope that they never do, but I'm just enjoying it for now. So I'm enjoying that. I think that the team that has been chosen for this book is very inspired. Like, once again, Nightcrawler is chosen because he is the adopted brother of Rogue. He is also very close with Logan. Logan is very close with Rogue. He is the first person who accepted her onto the team, which is actually something that comes into play in this comic. Gambit, once again, Rogue's husband. He's also been friends with Wolverine and Jubilee, who is very much a 90s character who is associated with these characters who were all in the 90s team with her. So that is a very inspired choice for this group of characters. And it's interesting because as they're setting up kind of a civil war between her team and Scott's team, he actually calls them, with the exception of Nightcrawler, the most pig-headed mutants. So I think that that is, once again, a really inspired approach to this team. Like, it's almost all of the Rogue characters that all are coming together in this group. What's also really breathtaking about this comic is, once again, the artwork. This is some of the best designs and the best artwork I have ever seen for these characters, and that is really saying something. You just want to gaze at every single page because of how good it looks, and it's what makes me excited to see a new issue of this comic every month. And the new characters, the new teens that they meet, I actually am interested in their stories. They actually have they've had some panels to explore little bits of their backstory that they're gradually revealing throughout the series, and I'm actually surprised to see that that each character has a distinct personality, and I'm curious to see where they're gonna go with them. And the flashbacks building up the villain to her connection with Charles Xavier is probably the best part of this comic, because they give you just enough so you can start piecing it together yourself to make it interesting, but the dialogue and consistency of those scenes were probably the best in the entire book. Now we have to get to the flaws, though, and this is kind of the flaw, one of the major flaws of comics these days, is that here we have a good story, and that's good on its own, because most comics I see don't even have a good story, but it's one that is just executed very poorly. Like, the editing is just not there. And what do I mean by that? Well, for example, the dialogue. The dialogue is a major problem in this comic. Now, I am no stranger to reading old comics and seeing overdone, cliche, stereotypical dialogue, but Gail Simone, who is writing this comic, does it in such a way that a lot of it takes me out of the story, because I'm trying to understand what the character is saying grammatically. I'm trying to hear it in my head, and I just can't, and it takes me out of the story so much. That is one of the main problems. For example, Rogue's southern accent is not just overdone, it's just such a caricature of a southern accent. It doesn't even sound authentic. I can't even really hear it in my head. For example, here's some dialogue from the first book. Mighta, coulda, gotta, might, overconfident. And I'm like, all you need to do is write it could have got a mite overconfident with this one. And like that flows in your head, but it's so overdone in this page that it took me out of it. And her dialogue, and she has most of the dialogue in this book, is so overdone like that it's constantly taking me out of it as I'm trying to hear it in my head, but I just can't because it just does not sound natural to this story. Another issue I thought was funny is I think that, and sometimes writers will do this, or editors will do this, they'll forget that Gambit is not French, he's Cajun. So in the first issue, he's talking with a lot of Z's in front of his words, like, what is? Like, he's French, you know? But then it's like a few issues later, they finally remembered, oh, he's Southern, not French. And so he starts talking in this really overdone old-time Southern accent, like listening to corn grow it is. And once again, it just does not sound natural. For characters who typically have very overdone accents in comics, this just does not sound natural to the time. A Gambit should not be talking like an 1800s Southern person. Now, to get to other aspects of the dialogue that are just taking me out of this story, remember what I said about writers inserting their fetishes into comics or fetish dialogue? Well, there's some of that there. Nightcrawler outright says that he enjoys furry parties in the middle of a battle with one of the characters, and I'm like, what? That's not who Nightcrawler is, but I'm like, I don't need that in a comic book, and this is part of the problem I was having why I stopped reading comics, is I got so tired of dialogue with that. Another scene is there's this really, really adorable scene with Gambit and Rogue in the first issue, and I really couldn't wait to read it when I saw this panel, but then I saw the dialogue, and Rogue says, "This is why when people ask Remy, my sexuality is 100% X-Men." No one talks like that. That is Twitter speak. That is something that might pick up when you write it on Twitter, because there's a certain kind of dialect of things that pick up when you're on that app. But that is not how anyone ever talks in real life. And once again, that's just stuff like that that takes me out of the story. And there's various bits of dialogue like that throughout the book, and it just takes me out, and it makes it so I'm trying to enjoy what I think is a great story in terms of the overall idea of it, but it's the dialogue and actual execution that's taken me out. And there's other aspects as well, like, for example, they're building up that Gambit has stolen the Eye of Agamotto, and that's going to be a big thing. But when they introduce that he's having problems with it, it comes out of nowhere in the panel and is forgotten as quickly as it comes up. And that's not the right way to develop a subplot that's going to have significance later. The other thing is, every time I get to an end of the issue, I always feel like I didn't get enough. And that's a good thing in the sense that I am still very, very much invested going forward with it. But it's a bad thing in that I want to feel satisfied when I read an issue of a comic. I don't want to feel like I got ripped off, or there just could have been more, or that it was lacking. That's what it feels like. Like, I get so excited for every issue, but then it's a bit lacking in the end. That said, the book is gradually getting better as it goes on, even with all those flaws. There was a great scene in the recent issue where Rogue has to fight the new villain, and they do a great job of setting up the fear factor of this villain and how strong she is. First, she defeats Logan. Logan tells Rogue she won't be able to defeat her without his healing factor, and then even with the healing factor, we see Rogue, who is like powerful as Superman, just getting tossed around like a rag doll. She gets her bones broken, and it really sets up this villain as how strong it is. And there's an element of ambiguity, so it can be that strong, and so that we don't really know what we're dealing with, and so that intimidation factor is there. And the ending of this comic is really, really exciting, as you don't know if you know Rogue is gonna make it, but you don't really know if she's gonna make it. You know how that is. Even though you know how everything's gonna end up in the end, you don't know how it's gonna play out, so the tension is still there. And then Gambit, I am so glad that this character is finally getting a lot of love, and to see him gather everyone together in a big stand, and to see where this might be building up for him to have a big moment with Rogue in the next issue, that was really exciting to see. And so issue 4 really, really hyped me to see the rest of the series. But the frustration is, I think that you would have had a masterpiece of a story here if it just had better dialogue, better development of the story. Like, here's the big thing. This whole thing revolves around Rogue wanting to recreate the X-Men and find that family again. And a lot of this is based in a very good understanding of Rogue's character. She is kind of a little girl at heart. She is always trying to find that sense of belonging, given her upbringing, given her past. But the big event that they make it that spurs this whole story is that Rogue goes to the hospital to visit a little kid who dies of cancer 15 seconds after she arrives, who was a big fan of the X-Men. and Rogue has a breakdown over it. It doesn't really make sense to me because, as she notes in the story, she is no stranger to death, and this was something that was none of her fault, but it makes her break down and go on this big depression phase and is the motivator of the entire story. And I'm like, you need to have your motivator for the entire story have a better setup than that. Like, if this kid had died because the X-Men had to save him, but the X-Men weren't together and there, then that would have been completely understandable motivation for why Rogue feels so bad that the X-Men aren't together like they used to be for her and what she recognizes them as, and to give her that motivation. But it's just not there. And once again, I know that I've talked a lot of criticisms about this comic, but there is a lot that I'm loving about it. I love the characters using their first names. I love the interactions between these characters. I love how the writer, Gail Simone, does understand the history and who these characters are to each other. She is even adding stuff like, once again, Nightcrawler is technically Rogue's adopted brother, but that hasn't been really explored before, and she's bringing that back. So there is a lot that I love about this comic. It's exciting for me to read, but at the same time, I can't really recommend it to somebody who wants to get back into comics because there are so many flaws. It's almost like reading somebody's rough draft, and you know that the rough draft, once it's done well, is going to be a masterpiece, but this never went through the extra steps in editorial to really get out those kinks and really make it great. But meanwhile, over to DC Comics, we have Absolute Batman, and Absolute Batman was getting rave reviews, and even though I was completely gypped on anything DC, I figured I have to read it. So I put it off for weeks, and then I finally sat down and read it, and I was not disappointed by it at all. And as much as I criticize Uncanny X-Men, all these problems with it that are just holding it back from being the true masterpiece that I know it could be, Absolute Batman does not have any of those problems. The development of the story was flawless. I didn't have any complaints about it with the way it revealed things and all that, and there was no dialogue that took me out of the story. All of the dialogue sounded natural to the world that it is in. None of it stopped to give some weird fetish dialogue or just some weird fetish scene like in a lot of comics I've seen lately, and I was just so happy with it. I'm like, Batman whips out his bat axe and cuts off somebody's arm, and he doesn't stop to tell us his furry fetish or anything like that. I know it's a very odd request. I have been through things, I have seen things that no one else has seen, but that's something I kind of like, But once again, this is just a very interesting story to me. Basically, Absolute Batman is one of Batman's parents was murdered, but his mother still lives, and this is a Bruce Wayne who is not a rich socialite. He is just a guy from a lower middle class family. He actually grew up with a lot of the people who are recognized as Batman's villains, like Waylon and Selina, and this time the Joker appears to be the rich socialite. So this is a total flip of the regular Batman character that has surprisingly never been done before, and I'm here for it. And you've got Alfred as like this undercover agent who's fighting Batman. Batman is very, very brutal, but he still has his no-kill rule, which honestly is just the same as Batman from Batman Begins. A lot of people were criticizing the artwork and the design for Batman, but it made a lot of sense to me in motion that you're trying to build Batman up as this mythical figure in this real world, and that is what the artwork does, and it does it very, very well. There were a lot of pages that just had great panel composition in terms of building up the emotion and the reveals of this issue, and knowing that fans are going to have the expectation for Batman to be some way, and how they're going to feel when these various reveals about who he is in this universe are going to come about. So this was basically a flawless comic. I didn't have any complaints for it as an Elseworld story. I literally could not think of one thing about this Absolute Batman comic that I could complain about. So where does that leave us with comics? Well, originally I was going to end this video with frustrations about how it seems like they're only able to get the best writing and the best editing to their prestige line, because Absolute Batman by Scott Snyder, more of a special release comic, same with the Ultimate line over at Marvel. But the more I'm looking at the way comics are going in the future, the more hope I have. Uncanny X-Men is getting better. They are telling very exciting stories, and what I see in the horizon for comics is more stories done by veterans, more stories that look like they're just generally fun, like Ultimate Wolverine or Hush Part 2. And so surprisingly, it's given me a lot of hope for comics after years of feeling like this would be a medium that just teeters off and dies. What they really need, though, is to start introducing new writers that actually have a passion for this medium and that actually have fresh stories to tell, and editors who can help them tell those stories to the best of their ability. In my opinion, comic books still have a long ways to go before I can wholeheartedly recommend them to everyone to read again. That said, this is the first time in a long time that I've had hope that there is still life left in this medium and still new stories to tell. But that's all I got for you guys today. What do you think about this rundown of modern comics? Are you interested in either of the stories that I've covered? Let me know in the comments below. I do the editing and everything here all by myself, and of course the comic book buying and all of the streaming service stuff and all of that to be able to read and watch all this to review it. So if you want to support me on Patreon, please check out the link in the description. Thank you all for supporting this channel as you've already done, and I will see you guys next time.